Okay, welcome everyone to my continuation of what are my favorite theorems. A very biased collection as usual, my favorite theorems. Very biased, obviously. I'm going to continue a little bit with the idea of these transcendental numbers, because there's a second type of, way to do it, which I'm going to explain. In the previous video, which you do not need to watch to follow this video, in the previous video, I had this approach of Mahler functions, which I really, really like, because it's kind of this idea of that fractals give transcendental numbers. But here's the more famous one, the more popular one, and arguably the more important one, if you want, because it kind of treats the usual numbers, the Gelfond-Schneider theorem. So Gelfond-Schneider, named after two people, who did it essentially independently around the same time, so mid of the 1930s. And, well, in my biased world, it's really the idea that logarithms give transcendental numbers. Strictly speaking, probably people will say exponential functions give transcendental numbers. But logarithms and exponential functions are essentially the same. But logarithms to me sounds right, while exponential functions sound wrong. I don't know. So I go with logarithms, but you can have exponential functions in mind if you want. So let's get going. Kind of the same idea as before. In the previous video, there are those funny numbers I call transcendental numbers. And the one that is important for this video is 2 to the square root of 2, 2 to the square root of 2, which is the Gelfond-Schneider constant. Yeah, and that has something to do with the theorem we're going to talk about. Spoiler, spoiler, sometimes called Hilbert number. We'll come back to that in a second. And that's a transcendental number, which is not really easy to show. Using the theorem, it's not so difficult. But kind of doing it by hand, it's kind of really difficult to prove that this one is transcendental. And it's kind of the whole point here in this game. So the transcendental numbers are not roots of polynomials. For example, our friend 2 to the square root of 2. But how do you prove that? That's usually like super annoying, although almost all numbers are transcendental. Proving that some specific number is transcendental is usually very difficult. So what people are often looking for are, kind of transcendental number generators, some kind of approach that generates transcendental numbers instead of doing everything by hand. Like proving by hand that 2 to the square root of 2 is a transcendental number. And the Gelfond-Schneider approach is one of them, probably the most popular, probably the most successful in a certain sense, approach to kind of having a machine that produces transcendental numbers. So let's have a look at the statement itself. So it all originates in Hilbert's seventh problem. So Hilbert gave this list of 23, I guess, if I'm not completely wrong, 23 problems at the, turn of the century. And the turn of the century means not from 1999 to 2000, but the one before. So Hilbert gave this list of 23 problems. Some of them are kind of really weirdly stated. But some of them are pretty straightforward questions, and you can answer them yes or no. And the seventh of them is essentially about transcendental numbers, because at that state, it was kind of already well known that almost all numbers are transcendental, but not many numbers were known to be transcendental. The proof that pi is transcendental, for example, was a bit earlier than Hilbert's seventh problem here, but it's like whatever. It's like not that nice. Anyway, we'll come back to that later. So Hilbert was then asking about the following question, which kind of seems reasonable if you know the standard example. So if you take two algebraic numbers and one of them is irrational, something like 2 to the square root of 2. Yeah, so this is B, this is A. You take two of them, and then the question is A to the B transcendental? Like 2 to the square root of 2 here, our friend 2 to the square root of 2. Another one is e to the pi, and you might argue e to the pi. That looks weird. They're both not algebraic, yeah. So how does it fit into the theorem? And here comes a reason to hate e to the pi. So e to the pi is already a weird thing to consider, because I think neither e nor pi are really kind of natural numbers. I'm very biased. I'm very sorry. But even to write down as a pi, maybe in your life you would write down the definition of pi. But writing down the definition of e needs someone like Euler to do it, I guess. So it's kind of really strange. But anyway, people like those two numbers. But they don't fit into the theorem. But here comes another reason to hate them, because actually e to the pi is -1 to the minus I. -1 to the minus I. I think this is a ridiculous fact. It's very easy to prove if you know Euler's formula, but it's a fun, ridiculous fact. Anyway, if you know this expression of e to the pi, it immediately fits into the theorem. So this proves that e to the pi, so into the question in this case, it will be the theorem in a second. And this proves that e to the pi is transcendental. And again, I said again, e to the pi for me personally, that's a weird number, but a lot of people like that because it has e and pi. Anyway, what I think is a more reasonable number to consider is something like log 2 over log 3, and that's kind of follows from the equivalent, the logarithm approach to this problem. The logarithm is a transcendental number generator, and it's kind of this thing here. If you have two non-zero algebraic numbers, then the ratio between the logarithms, and it doesn't matter which logarithm you take, is either rational or transcendental. And I feel like this is a more natural thing to write down because it involves numbers I understand, 2 and 3, instead of numbers I don't understand, like e. So this is really just, in this case, what is it, log 32 or something, some crazy stuff like that. So if you put a log and you put two reasonable numbers here, they should always be somewhat transcendental. That's kind of the question here asked by Hilbert. So these are kind of the numbers addressed by Hilbert's question, and around 1900, this was kind of widely open. It was solved like about 30 years later. And the idea is really, I really like this picture way more than the exponential. I'm very sorry, nobody likes it. Honestly, just kidding. I just like this one a lot because in this case, you can really fit in kind of useful numbers if you want, 2 and 8, for example. So log 2, 8 is 3 because 2 to the 3 is 8. Okay. But what you want is kind of the logarithm should be a transcendental number generator. So whenever you put in some integer, and it's not a prime power, let's say the base is the prime. If it's not a prime power, there should be a transcendental number. So log 2 is not very exciting, but log 3, for example, is a transcendental number. Whatever here. Log 4 is the prime power of 2, so this is not, and of course it's not, and then so on, 5 and 6. Transcendental numbers. And that's kind of a nice statement, I think, and that's why I have this and this is a consequence of the Gelfond-Schneider theorem. That's why I have, for the Gelfond-Schneider theorem, I always have like logarithms in mind. Because I personally, I say it again, I probably sound like a broken record. But who likes e? Who cares about e to the pi? Anyway, so here's then the statement. Hilbert's 7 problem is true. Let's go back. Hilbert's 7 problem is exactly the question whether a to the b is transcendental for those a and b, or equivalently, the logarithm question. Okay. And yeah, so transcendental numbers, that's kind of cool. It solves the question of a to the b, if you want, or the logarithm one. But there are still so many, in particular, some sums. The linear combinations are usually really tricky. Whatever, pi minus e. Again, who likes those numbers? But anyway, pi minus e would be something that is still open. It doesn't quite fit into the framework. And as we said, e to the pi is like ridiculous because it's something like -1 to the minus I, which is just a ridiculous coincidence. Fits into the theorem, but pi to the e, you really can't rewrite pi to the e. It's just I don't know what happens in pi to the e. Anyway, so the whole theorem is based on something kind of more basic, which was already known around Hilbert's time, which is called the Lindemann-Weierstrass theorem, and that one is then really about kind of the natural logarithm. I personally prefer the Gelfond-Schneider theorem because it's about the logarithms with suitable numbers. I guess I shitted on the exponential function a lot and the e number a lot in this video, but I kind of feel like writing down a log base 10, a log base 2, a log base 5 is somewhat more reasonable than writing down a log base. But anyway, the original one is a Lindemann-Weierstrass theorem, and it was about the log base e. And turns out that the log base e is transcendental number generator, and this is kind of much easier to show. And for example, showed that pi is transcendental since something like this is not transcendental. So transcendental number generator, if you take a non-silly algebraic number, then whatever you get out is transcendental. So let's say pi is clearly, if pi would not be transcendental, then this equality could not be true. And more straightforward, e is transcendental because you can fit in R1, for example, in the function. But anyway, so the difference between the two is like quite a difference in years. So this starts at 85 and the other one is like whatever, 35, something like that. And it's really the difference between whether you consider the natural logarithm or a logarithm with kind of more integer base, within an integer base. Anyway, I apologize for shitting on E, but honestly, who likes E? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I also hope to see you next time.